I just watched an episode of South Park on Netflix and had one of those moments. The past rushing back, history in an instant. I haven't watched South Park since I was living in San Francisco. This was 1996 or 7, which was, come to think of it, around the same time The King of the Hill first aired too. I was in a band back then, and Mark, the guitarist, lived upstairs. The place was in the Mission District, 22nd and Florida. Sketchy, as neighborhoods go. A guy who looked like Thor in miniature, cobalt gray beard and all, who everybody called Cranky Frankie because he sold speed for a living and was no stranger to it, lived across the street. I only had one meaningful interaction with Cranky Frankie, and though it wasn't a good one, no resentments were harbored. This dust-up occurred right after I moved into the apartment across the street, right after I finished house-sitting for Michael Jackson's stage manager. The house-sitting gig on Nob Hill, which only lasted a week, was fortuitous. For sure it was an upgrade from the couch surfing I'd been doing at Adam and Natalie's, but the timing was perfect. Adam and Natalie were about to have their first and only child and needed somebody to watch their dog. Their dog's name was Dot. Dot was a crazy, dangerous dog they had rescued from behind a dumpster. But Dot and I had always gotten along. We'd shared the same room in Adam and Natalie's flat in south of Market. Their place on Folsom and 8th was my first home in San Francisco. I'd been languishing for months in Connecticut since my drunken escape from Miami, and Adam had offered to host me in the apartment he shared with his new wife. And, as luck would have it, a caravan traveling from east to west, spearheaded by college roommate Roderick and his friend Mel, had already been organized. So that spring, which was very possibly April of 1996, I embarked on my first and only cross-country road trip. My final destination had been Adam and Natalie's, and I stayed on their couch for half of Natalie's second and some of her third trimester. At that point, I'd been politely asked to leave, so they could spend their final few weeks as a childless couple alone. By the time Natalie went into labor with a boy who would be named Larry, I was living in the in-law flat beneath Jill's apartment, across the street from Cranky Frankie. And Adam asked me if I'd host Dot for a few days, while they were waiting for Larry to be born. Soon after taking Dot in, Kaylee from Limerick, Ireland, who was living upstairs in Jill's place, asked if she could take Dot for a walk. I cautioned her about Dot, but Kaylee wasn't troubled by Dot's insanity, saying not to worry, that she'd be back in an hour. I think Kaylee was keen to walk Dot because it was clear, when you looked at Dot, that nobody was going to fuck with anybody holding Dot on a leash. And as I mentioned, this part of the mission was sketchy, or at least it was back then. I handed her the leash and, a few minutes later, I left. Maybe to work, maybe for coffee, I can't remember. But I got back a couple of hours later, so it probably wasn't work. When I got home, Dot was back in the apartment, lying calmly on the floor. I was lighting a cigarette when Kaylee appeared, exasperated and wide-eyed. The dog, she said, was nuts. On their walk, Dot had gotten loose and lunged at Cranky Frankie, and there had been blood. Cranky Frankie, for his part, was not content to simply nurse his wounds. Since the attack, he'd been walking the street, armed with indignation, attempting to convince the other neighbors to band together with him, to demand Dot be banished from the neighborhood. I would like to say that I had determined that this would lead inevitably to animal control capturing and detaining Dot. I'd like to say that is what prompted my next course of action. The truth is, I panicked, deciding it was of the utmost importance that I get Dot out of the neighborhood myself and as quickly as possible. This all occurred a week before my boss at Bank of America stole my 1990 Acura Integra, so I was able to stuff Dot in the back of my car and head to south of Market, where a guy named Steve Co. was living beneath a highway overpass inside a fenced-in yard. This was early in the dot-com boom, and you could get away with doing that sort of thing back then. Steve Co. was an industrial artist, and the big project he was working on was a life-size mousetrap. I did see the mousetrap in operation at a party celebrating its completion, but that was much later, and Steve Co. was currently just building it. Anyway, I showed up unannounced with Dot, and as the gate wasn't open, I began yelling for him. I remember the fence is high, but it couldn't have been too high because Dot was not a small dog, and when it became clear that Steve Coe wasn't around, I helped Dot over the fence and onto his property. Dot was perfectly happy with the arrangement. She'd been here before, and Dot got along fine with Steve Coe's dog. I arrived home to a message on my answering machine from Steve Coe. He was even-tempered but displeased, telling me that he couldn't keep Dot, couldn't afford to feed Dot, and that I'd better come and get her in the next 24 hours. After that, I tracked down Adam and explained what happened. Adam, like Steve Coe, was displeased. He was preoccupied with Natalie's labor, of course, but went over to Steve Coe's lot and picked up Dot, taking her back to their Folsom Street flat. Since Dot wasn't returning to my apartment, I went across the street to apologize to Cranky Frankie for the trouble. Someone later would say that Frankie had gotten what he had deserved because he'd been taunting Dot insufferably before Dot attacked him. But all that happened 3 or 4 months before Mark, guitarist and friend, arrived from Miami. Mary and I had split, and I was dating Krista at the time. There had been a room available up in Jill's place since Kaylee went back to Ireland, so Mark moved in. Incidentally, Jill was also the friend who helped me score the house-sitting gig at Michael Jackson's Stage Managers. And she convinced her landlord to let me rent the in-law apartment downstairs. There was another guy up there in Jill's place too, in the 3rd apartment, Gary. Gary was also a guitarist, and he would, a year later, sell me the car I'd need to move to Los Angeles. My car, by the time Mark arrived, was long gone, rumored to have been found totaled in some border town in Texas, and the boss who stole it was never seen again. One day, and I don't remember whether Mark and I were practicing or recording, all those days kind of run together since there was so much drugs, so much booze, so many guitars, Mark said, "You got to see this show." That show was King of the Hill, and the main character I recognized from Beavis and Butthead. I wasn't sure if Mark had ever seen Beavis and Butthead, but I had been a fan since friends from New Haven, Connecticut had turned me onto it. The introduction to South Park came a few months later, after the band had broken up. The band broke up because Mark moved back to Miami, and Mark moved back to Miami because he learned he had a kid back there. And the band couldn't survive his departure, because me and Mark were the only 2 people in the band. And though we'd recorded 3 albums in the 8 months he was in San Francisco, Mark was the only person in the band with any musical skills, really. Parenthetically, I would eventually learn from Adam that he was the one who convinced Mark he ought to go back to Miami. Years later, Mark discovered that the kid was not his after all, but Mark enjoyed fatherhood, had no regrets, and even raised another one. The woman who took Mark's room in Jill's apartment after Mark left introduced me to South Park. Her name was Feliz, and Feliz said you could call her whatever you wanted, but Feliz was how her name was pronounced, not Felice. Feliz had fair skin, red hair, and looked like a different kind of Sissy Spacek. Her name was pronounced Feliz because her family was Tatar. Anyway, Feliz didn't like her name, her family, herself, anything really. And I don't remember the spelling, even though it was definitely simple. Feliz and I became friends after she'd moved into Mark's old room, but the introduction to South Park, that occurred after she'd moved out. I was visiting her new 1-bedroom on North Beach, and we were watching Comedy Central. And she said, when South Park came on, "You got to see this show." And now, 25 years later, more or less, I randomly decided to watch South Park again. It's been so long since I've seen the show, and when I pressed play, episode 3 of season 1 came on, an episode about a hunting trip with Stan's Uncle Jimbo. And this was the episode that Feliz and I watched that night in San Francisco, and the reason all of these memories came rushing back.